Today we're talking about Apache ORC, which is a project that I suspect many of us haven't heard of. So let's start with, tell us what it is.
Okay, Apache ORC is a project about the ORC file format, and it's a columnar file format that gives you high-speed access for Hive or Spark or Hadoop workloads. So it's really designed for very large scale reads and writes of columnar data.
And it's in the open, in the big data space. And
correct.
It's always going to be used by those projects, or is it used outside of those projects?
It can be used outside of the projects, but mostly it's used by the big data projects.
All right.
And it originally developed because in the Hive community, we realized that we needed a more advanced file format. There was a file format that was already columnar. Columnar means that each column, each field in the data is stored as a single unit. So instead of, say, taking one value from each column and saving it as a row, you have all the values for column 1, all the values for column 2, all the values for column 3. And that is important for performance, and actually in two directions. First, it lets you compress it better because all of column 1 is more likely to be like the other values in column 1, and so it compresses tighter. It also lets you do things like run length encoding. So, for example, if you have 1 million zeros in a row, that will encode very tightly, which it won't with zlib, right? But we can, actually in that case it would compress pretty tightly with zlib, but we also handle, for example, the case where it goes up by 1 on each. And so we can handle different widths, and we then encode it with either zlib or snappy or whatever you want on top.
Why did you do this as a separate project then, rather than...
Actually, we didn't.
Okay.
It originally started in Hive, and we put it in there precisely because we were watching, we were part of the Hive community, and we watched the person who originally did the Hive's original file format complain bitterly that someone was trying to put in bindings to Trevny, which was another file format that was done. And he said, oh, we don't need another file format. We're like, oh crap. We've got this one that's mostly done. Let's see if we can salvage this, because Hive integration was really important to us. And so we decided, okay, we'll go talk to the Facebook guys and get him to sign off on this as a good idea. We'll make it part of Hive so he views it. And then actually the old one was called RC file, and so we made it optimized RC file. And so he thought this was a great idea, and it went in, and the rest is history. So ORC was buried in the middle of Hive, right? It wasn't at the top of the build tree, and it wasn't at the bottom, it was in the middle. And so then when we decided, okay, we're getting less adoption of our project precisely because people have to pick up all of Hive, and Hive is a relatively large project. It's not the biggest, but it's large, and people were picking up all of Hive in order to get at ORC. And furthermore, because it was buried in a large project, that meant that the needs of Hive were very dominant in the code base, and other projects were not considered as important or urgent. And so we wanted to fix that. And so we spun it out, which was a lot of work. When we first did the analysis, ORC depended on 16,000 classes outside of Hadoop and protobuf, because we knew we needed Hadoop and protobuf as dependencies anyway, so I excluded those, and it was still 16,000 classes, including both Avro and Parquet, which are other file formats, and I found that pretty amusing. But we managed to get it spun out as a TLP. It's a relatively small PMC. It's got actually a large committer base, and part of the reason is when you split Apache projects out, first of all, you don't go through incubator, but what does happen is that you want to be very permissive in who in the old project you allow into the new project. And so we basically let all of the Hive committers stay committers on the ORC project, because we weren't trying to exclude anyone. That wasn't our goal. And so we were very, very focused at, okay, yes, anyone who, even if they've never done any patches on ORC, if they're a Hive committer and ask, we'll put them in as a committer on ORC.
So it's a file format. What else is there to do? How does the project stay active?
Okay, so there's a lot of different pieces. First of all, part of the reason it's columnar is because often you want to read just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 columns out of 100 columns. And so if you don't need to read those bytes, decompress those bytes, it's much faster. So that can save you a lot of time. The other thing that it can do is you can push down a predicate and say, okay, I only want to see records where, let's make up an example, where someone has a paycheck over $200,000. And so it'll look through its indexes and say, okay, we need to look at this 10,000 rows, these 10,000 rows, and that 10,000 rows. And so we can skip a lot of the file that way also. Now, there are other features that we're adding that aren't quite in yet that are pretty exciting. Like one of the features we've been asked for a while is the ability to protect some columns and not other columns. And so, for example, we're adding column encryption, which will just compress that column. And so if you have PII information, personal identifiable information in one column, like social security numbers or whatever, you can encrypt that column and only let the people who have permission to read that column read it, even if they can read the rest of the file. And so it'll silently, if you have access to the key, it'll decrypt the data, otherwise it'll give you nulls.
If people want to get involved in the project,
that's another advantage of being a small project, is like we're a very welcoming community, and it's much easier to get into the code base, right? The code base is much, much smaller than Hive's code base. And doing all the unit tests takes a matter of minutes and not the 24 hours that Hive's unit tests take. And so making a change is much, much easier on the smaller project. We also spent a lot of time, of course, working on doing talks and reaching out to people, especially now that we're a TLP. Now, for example, one of our engineers at Hortonworks has been going through and speeding up the access from Spark into ORC file. And actually the Flink guys did the same thing for Flink. And so it's been really good, actually. We also spent actually more time on our website than Hive has spent on theirs in a really long time. And so people told me that our documentation for ORC is really good and helped them a lot in terms of picking up what functions are available.
a couple days ago I talked with another project,
Mm-hmm.
which will remain unnamed, that was discussing spinning out a sub-project into a top-level project.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do badly in your transition that you could warn them against?
Okay, mostly it was just a lot of work. When we started the project, we put it into the build in the place it made sense. But unlike some projects, it wasn't a separate repo. It was buried into the code base. And so that made it really easy for other developers to connect things in, which is part of how we got into such a tangled mess. In terms of what things that we did that they should avoid, the biggest mistake I made is, first, a good thing I did was, before moving the code out, I made a separate module and set up that module so it's still part of Hive's build, but it was a self-contained Maven directory, and so I could control the dependencies. And the bad thing I did that I wanted to hit is that I renamed that module to be org.apache.org, because that was the eventual goal, but I shouldn't have done that while it was still in Hive, because then Hive made a release with org Apache ORC, and I'm like, that was frustrating, because then you have to deal with, okay, if they have that version of the code, then this is how you get backwards compatibility, and it would have been much, much easier if I'd waited until the project was actually, the code was out before I did the rename of the package. Would have been a little annoying and made the adoption harder in terms of switching Hive over to the standalone org, but that went relatively smoothly. Unfortunately, I ended up writing a tool that helped me with that dependency management stuff, because the 16,000 classes was just crazy. And so actually I took one of the I think it was B-Cell, actually. There's a library that lets you analyze Java bytecodes, and it had a thing that was doing a dependency graph. I changed it so that it would track classes, and then I used that to find where I was depending on pieces I didn't want to depend on, and filtered it down. It also meant that we took a piece of Hive. There's about 40 classes that I couldn't remove the dependency on, but they had to stay in Hive because they were critical to Hive's internal operation. So those I made a separately releasable package. So Hive went from having one thing that they released to two, and they release independently. And so I broke the dependency chain that way, so that everything that ORC needs is in storage API, so that can release independently. Then ORC can make a release that uses that, and then the rest of Hive makes a release that depends on it. So yeah, be very careful with your dependency chain. Don't make loops. Loops are bad.
So I assume you have the standard user and dev lists for people who
Of
get
course.
involved.
And yep, come check out the community. We're a pretty friendly group, and tell us what you're up to and what you'd like to see changed in ORC.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Good luck on ORC.
Thank you.